Well, greetings of peace, everybody. This is the day that God has made, and truly we rejoice, 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 and are glad in it. We're so glad to welcome each one of you. Again, if you're here, please let us know of where you're checking in from today, the name of your church or district or team that you're on. And we want to say a big welcome. And it is just a joy to welcome Drew Hart to be with us today as well. So you all can welcome him as well. My name is Reverend LaDonna Nkosi, Reverend LaDonna Sanders Nkosi, and I'm the Director of Intercultural Ministries with the Church of the Brethren. And it's just a great joy to invite everyone today to be a part of this conversation and this presentation from Drew Hart, who will be a witness. And so I want to, as each one of you is introducing yourself, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for being here. And I want to take an opportunity to thank Drew for being here as well and to share his bio. And so we can go ahead and come both of us on screen. And so Drew, it's so good to welcome you today. You want to go ahead and say hi to the people before I read your bio and just greet everyone?
Absolutely. Yeah. Hey, everybody. I wish I could see everyone's face, but I'm grateful to be here and to be in conversation with you all. And so looking forward to our time, not only just to talk, but our conversation afterwards.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, dear friends, we're so excited to be launching this Healing Racism, Congregations and Communities series. And that's our 2021 theme. And it is a great joy to welcome you, Drew, as our opening speaker. And I know you'll be traveling with us throughout the year in different ways. And so certainly you are not new to the scene, but just we're so honored to have you and welcome you, I should say, to the space. And so I would just like to share with everyone that Drew G.I. Hart is an assistant professor of theology at Messiah University and has 10 years of pastoral experience. He is the director of Messiah University's Thriving Together Congregations for Racial Justice program. Also, he's the co-host of the Inverse podcast. Drew Hart is the author of Trouble I've Seen, Changing the Way the Church Views Racism, and Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. Drew Hart was the recipient of the BCM Peace 2017 Peacemaker Award, the 2019 W.E.B. Du Bois Award in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and he was also Elizabethtown College's 2019 Peace Fellow. Drew and his family live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And it's just a joy to gather today. Many people have read and been moved by your books, Drew, and many people will read them after this. So we want to say, dear friends who are on here, let's just give a big welcome to Drew Hart. Welcome, Drew.
Thank you. Thank you. That was very kind. And just grateful. Thank you, Reverend LaDonna, for the invitation. And I know that you are such a gift to the Church of the Brethren. And so I hope they realize what a gift they have, that they're so blessed to have you in this role and the ongoing work that you're doing. So thank you for that. And yeah, I will just jump right into my talk. I want to just tell you a little story. A few years back when I moved, I'm a Pennsylvania boy, right? Philly to Harrisburg, back to Philly, and then Harrisburg again. And so I moved back to Harrisburg in 2016, in the fall of 2016, to begin teaching. And in coming back, I had a lot of connections here in Harrisburg. I usually call it my second home. And so there was a local church that almost immediately asked me to come and speak. They were doing a series on race and racism for the month of January. And so they invited me to come and to kind of be the final speaker in their series. And so I came, I did my talk, I did a Sunday school session with them, and it was a really great conversation. In response to that, they actually decided, I had mentioned the Civil Rights Bus Tour that one of my friends leads. And so they actually decided to send their folks from their congregation, along with a partnering congregation in the city, to the Civil Rights Bus Tour, 9-day trip. And at the end of it, they actually asked my friend to come speak. And so almost exactly 1 year later, after I had spoken, my friend was there, African-American scholar as well, who leads the Civil Rights Bus Tour. And he was there getting ready to get up and speak. And they're showing like pictures and probably like sentimental music, right, of their experiences during the Civil Rights Bus Tour. And right before he's about to get up and the kind of video and photo montage or whatever you want to call it ended, a white gentleman, older white gentleman, stood up in the middle of the congregation and yelled out, "Why can't we just get over it?" And then that was just kind of in the air, in the space, right? Why can't we just get over it? And so when my friends like told me that that happened right before he was about to get up, my mouth almost dropped. Like, wow, like trying to fathom and think about like, what would I have said or done in response to that kind of moment? And so I was thinking about it. I often joke and say, I think it's a wholly troubled mind, but my mind goes places because I begin to wonder, like, what would I have done? Because I often see these moments not necessarily as moments that just shut down space, but actually can be leaned into for learning moments, right? So I imagine that if I was there, what kind of holy trouble might I have gotten myself into to spark more deeper conversation? And so I thought maybe that, I might ask some questions, right? I might ask some questions. For example, I might ask this gentleman, because I don't know anything about his life at all. I might ask him, to tell me about his life. Like, has he lived a life committed to racism and racial justice, for decades and decades? And now finally, at the end of his life, he feels like the work has been done. There's no more, and it's time to get over it, right? Like, I want to know about his story that makes him think that at this moment now, why get over it now? Maybe I would ask him about his, not just his own life, but his family line, right? Maybe, I don't want to presume, maybe his great grandfather was, an abolitionist against slavery. And maybe, his father walked with Martin Luther King and struggled for civil rights. And the way he was seeing it was that there's been this long line of faithfulness, right? Everyone in his line had been committed to doing this work for so long. And now as far as he could interpret, the work is over, it's done. And so he wanted to, get over it. Maybe everybody, I would ask him about his community, right? Maybe his faith community. Everybody had been committed throughout his life to anti-racism and racial justice and intercultural sensitivity and awareness and good practices and just being thoughtful, intentional in terms of how they do life together. And so maybe that had just been so embedded into who everyone around him has been that, again, finally he could wipe his hands and say, let's get over it. It's time to get over it. But of course, if you know anything about America and the United States, we know that that is rarely the case. In fact, I don't know if that's anybody's story, right? Especially certainly not for white Christians, that is so rare of a story to find someone where everyone in their family line has been doing the work, where one's own life, the whole entire decades have been doing the work, and everyone's community around them have been doing the work. The more likely reality is that most people live in contexts where they have not, in their own life, been committed to anti-racism and racial justice and intercultural awareness. That most people's family lines going back generations reveal high levels of complicity and perpetuating racism, or at best silence for most people, as it relates to all the injustices that have gone on from slavery to Jim Crow up to the present day. And certainly faith communities, the research shows that white Christian communities are more likely to express racial sentiments according to data, right, and research and surveys than non-Christians. And so Christian communities have most often not been places where that work has been deeply rooted out. And so if most likely he fits into the paradigm of most people's experiences all across the United States and the data that we see all across the states, then the question might not be, can we get over it? Maybe the real question is, can we get on it for the first time, right? And I think that maybe is a more helpful starting point for us to think about the need for this launching of the Healing Racism congregations, but also even to think about what it means for us to be a witness, and why I even wrote a book like Who Will Be a Witness, right? It's an invitation for us to get on it, to get on racial justice, to get on the healing of our society, to get on it in terms of actually linking arms with those that have been disproportionately suffering in our society today and struggling together for God's shalom, for God's dream for all of us. And so that's my hope, and that's some of what I hope we can explore a little bit right now. When I wrote Who Will Be a Witness, I wrote it precisely because I had been going around different congregations talking about race and racism, explicitly helping Christians think about what it means to be, what it means for our discipleship to Jesus to be explicitly anti-racist if we live in a racialized society, right? And I actually had really good responses from congregations all across the nation. But one of the things that I heard in response was, all right, Drew, so this makes sense. We see the vision and who Jesus is and how he relates to the realities of racism in our society, but it sounds like you want us to go and do justice. And what does that mean? What does that look like, right? And when I heard that question arise more than once, that I realized that we need to be thinking more about this idea around what it actually looks like on the ground in our own communities to be pursuing racial justice. And so that's what was the initial seed for me wanting to even write the book. And then out of that, of course, I'm not a social scientist, I'm a theologian, right? And so while I do have lived experience and I read up on that, I can offer so much more than that. And so I wanted to have us get to the root of some really serious issues. How do we understand Jesus Christ and how has he been domesticated, right? How do we tell a truthful story about the role and the life of the church as it relates to racism and white supremacy in our society? How do we talk about power dynamics and belonging and what it ought to be versus what it has too often been in the life of the church? And then ultimately, how do I then give tools that are faithful and effective tools for doing grassroots work that actually love our neighbors well and work alongside those who've been struggling for justice and for shalom and for the flourishing of all? And so that's some of the vision for why I wanted to write the book, was to kind of help orient the church around these issues. One of the biggest issues, I think, for me, when I think about, some of the challenges that the church finds itself in, is that we've deeply domesticated Jesus Christ. We've completely watered Jesus Christ down, spiritualized him, twisted his image, disfigured him in so many ways that it barely resembles the Jesus we find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, I would argue that there's been a massive failure of discipleship in the way of Jesus that has helped to contribute to the problems that we see today as it relates to Christians incapable of resisting and challenging white supremacy and racism in our society. If you think about just the basic idea of discipleship, right? Not just study groups, devotions, things like that, but literally helping people walk in the way of Jesus, to follow Jesus, to be formed in the image of Jesus, and ultimately to bear witness to the story of Jesus, even in our own lives, right? That discipleship ought to make the Jesus story visible for our neighbors in our own lives. And that's the central call. I mean, Jesus invites us to follow him, to take up our cross, deny ourselves, right? To take up our cross and follow Jesus in his way, said in so many different ways, right? To walk in his footsteps, right? As First Peter says, to follow the way of the Lamb, to participate in the life of the Christ, die and rise in Christ, to bear the image of the Son. There's so many different ways that the New Testament gets at this basic, simple idea that we ought to be committed to actually following Jesus and taking Jesus's life and teaching seriously. And that ought to be the story that unfolds our story into this greater story. And I believe that if we were taking that seriously, the same Jesus that said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to bring good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. That same Jesus, like if we were taking that Jesus seriously, we would also, there's no way that we couldn't be attentive to the injustices, to the harm, to the suffering that goes on in our society today. That maybe Jesus might not have explicitly talked about the exact issues that are going on in our society today, but he orients us and invites us into a kind of life that knows how to respond to these kind of challenges where people are hurting. Jesus centralized the least, last, and lost in our society, and we're invited to do the same in our own lives. I remember reading Robert Long's fairly recent book, right, White Too Long. And one of the things that is really fascinating when we think about this failure of discipleship is that he argues, and this is from data, this is just from national data, that white Christians, what they found, and he's a white Christian himself, found that white Christians are more likely to express racist sentiments than non-Christian whites, right? And that's not just white evangelicals, but white evangelicals, white mainlines, and white Catholics all made it more likely. And that was one of the central definers, right? That was more likely to happen in that case. Something terribly is wrong when it's more likely that someone who identifies as a Christian is going to express racist ideas than someone that is not a Christian. And so there's some really some work that needs to be done in the life of the church. I think that rather than sometimes we say the name of Jesus, but yet we vandalize the name of Jesus in terms of what we actually say and do in the public square. And too often, I think, rather than actually encountering the crucified Christ, I think that too often folks have been, converting Jesus into a mascot for the status quo, right? Instead of clinging to the one who the builders, the stone that the builders rejected, right? And the least, last, and lost of society, we've kind of used Jesus to bolster and status and to uphold the way things are rather than God's dream for us and the way God desires for things to be. It's often hard for us to have conversations because I think sometimes we forget like how controversial Jesus was in his own life. Like Jesus not only was he not a white supremacist, but he also wasn't a moderate or a centrist either, right? Like Jesus didn't go halvesies as it relates to if Samaritans should be seen as treated as fully human, right? Or halvesies as relates to vulnerable women or the poor or anything. He was fully committed. In fact, the reign of God was instituted in such ways that the first are last and the last are first, right? Prioritizing those who are most vulnerable in his midst. And so we've got to actually begin to take the life and teachings of Jesus more seriously, immersing ourselves in those things, and allowing that story, again, to shape and drive our own story. I think too often in many churches, there's what's done is, I call it in class, the cradle to the cross jump, right? Where people, they love baby Jesus, and we spend all the time on Christmas and baby Jesus, and then people jump and they want to talk about the death of Christ. But at the same time, all the majority of the Jesus story is kind of missing. And most people, or optional, right? For some people, it's almost like a buffet line. You take, well, I like this parable, I like that story, but I'll leave that other stuff, right? And so we kind of pick and choose what we think is significant for us, and we leave the rest. And so we make this cradle to cross jump that de-emphasizes and devalues the Jesus story, especially his life and teachings and his reign. I have a colleague at Messiah, Richard Crane, and he says, people treat Jesus like their crazy uncle, right? That like their crazy uncle. And what he means by that is that like when you go to a family like dinner, Thanksgiving dinner, and you're sitting around the table and people, you have maybe a guest with you and you have a family member, everyone's got that one family member that just says kind of off the wall stuff. And like you might say to your friend, your guest, you're like, oh, that's just, Uncle so-and-so. He just says stuff. Nobody takes him seriously, right? Well, Richard Crane, he says that's how we treat Jesus. Oh, that's just Jesus. He says he's really crazy off the wall stuff. He doesn't really mean for us to actually take that seriously, right? And so I think like, how do we find all these kind of fancy ways to dismiss and downplay Jesus and what he's inviting us into? And the other thing I say with my students is that we have domesticated even just the idea of what it means to take up your cross in such ways that it means anything and everything except state-sanctioned execution, right? If someone gives you a funny look because you're wearing a Christian t-shirt, that's your cross to bear. If, you didn't get that parking spot at the mall, you're bearing your cross for Jesus. Your electric blanket broke down in the middle of the winter, right? It's basically crucifixion. But, when other people are being targeted by the state and being killed by the states, right? And we name that and say, we ought to stand in solidarity and confront evil and overcome evil with good bodily in our own lives faithfully, then that seems to be off the wall. That's out of the question. Why would Christians want to do that? And so our understanding of take up your cross and follow Jesus seems to be so domesticated, and we've watered it down to make it fit with the kind of everyday normal American life, rather than transforming and challenging our way of life to mold to the Jesus story. But of course, it's not just a matter of domesticating Jesus Christ that I think has gotten us into this problem. In some ways, there's this much bigger reality that we've got to grapple with. We've got to actually tell a much more truthful story of church history and the life of the church and its role and complicity and perpetuation of white supremacy in our society today. I began wrestling with some of these questions, and I talk about these in the book. One of the stories I tell is just my first some chapels when I was an undergrad student, and how they just kind of awoke in me to they helped me realize that there's some serious issues that we've got to grapple with in the life of the church, especially as it relates to our Christian identity, our baptismal identity, and what it means to be followers of Jesus. And so the first chapel that I remember that really blew my mind was I was sitting in chapel. It was probably a year or two after 9/11 had happened. And we had a speaker. This was at Messiah University. We had a speaker come in. At the time, I had no idea who he was, but he was there, and he began to speak on the Sermon on the Mount. Right, he was teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, and he began to just teach on the peace of Christ, right? Love your enemies, turn the other cheek, blessed are the peacemakers, right? Just teaching basically the teachings of Jesus. And then he, for me, I had not grown up in a peace church tradition. That was not my experience. So I wasn't, it wasn't necessarily, the emphasis wasn't necessarily what I would have had grown up with. But he was teaching Jesus. And one of the things I was taught very early on in church is that Jesus is our center, right? Jesus is our focus. And so he had me intrigued in terms of the emphasis and the focus. And I was a biblical studies major at Messiah, so I was learning some of these things as well in the classroom. But then he went on. He didn't just stay there with Jesus' teachings. He began to try to connect the dots between Jesus' teachings and what was going on in our society at the time. He explicitly he just started unveiling things, talking about the spirit of revenge that was in our society at that time, right? And this desire to go to war, and the way that Christians in particular were kind of this war hungry at that moment. He got very political. He named George Bush by name, all these different things. And I was like, oh, he's really going there. He's stepping on toes, right? He's going to say what he really believes. But again, it was this Jesus-centered message. So I was intrigued. And so again, wasn't familiar as comfortable with it, but I love Jesus, and I wanted to be faithful to Jesus. So right as he was going in, I began to lean in, trying to really hear and listen to him and what he had to say. And in this auditorium, as he was speaking with thousands of students, as I'm leaning in, all of a sudden I hear some movements in the auditorium, feet moving, shuffling. All of a sudden I look over, hundreds and hundreds of students are getting up and they're marching out. They're stampeding out of the auditorium. They are upset. Some of them are yelling as they're leaving. And they're just upset about the fact that he would call out America for its engagement in the war, for its lies, for the spirit of revenge and all these things. And explicitly how he was tying it to Christian faith, right? And it was fascinating to me. One of the things that at that particular moment that I was taking away was, again, I was not I wouldn't have called myself a pacifist at that time. But it was a Jesus-centered message. So I wanted to hear and listen to what he had to say. And I was so confused because we had a whole range of speakers all the time. Like, why was this like the straw that, you know, that broke the camel's back? Like, why could they not sit and just listen and wrestle with what he had to say, especially since he was drawing straight from Jesus's teachings, right? Even if they disagreed, they could have went up and asked more questions and wanted to dialogue deeper and understand. But instead, what it seemed like, and especially after conversations that I had with students afterwards, it seemed that their Americanness, actually, they clung to their Americanness more than they were clinging to who they were in Jesus Christ. And that shut down conversation completely. And it shut down the possibility of wrestling with what was being said to them in that moment. And that was one of the early moments where I began to realize, I didn't have the language for it at that time fully, but that American exceptionalism and American idolatry, right, was deeply bound in some people's Christian formation, that those two things were submerged in one another. And so I had to kind of wrestle with what was going on. But there was a second chapel experience that I had. That was just one of them. The second one was a little bit smaller. We used to have these alternative chapels, and these alternative chapels, what would happen is, you could go to, like, you choose basically like what you wanted to go to. So like Thursdays, usually for alternative, these smaller groups. And there was a student of color led chapel at that time. It's kind of funny now when I think about it, but it was called Culture Shock. That's what it was called at the time. I don't know who came up with the name. We had it inherited by the time we came on campus. But it was student of color led, and this particular day when I went there was a guest speaker, this young Black man who was there, and he was a guest speaker. And I remember sitting and hearing him, and he began to like tell like the story of Scripture, of Israel's story, right? Israel, where this God that delivered the Israelites from slavery, and this God that stood against Israel when they oppressed and exploited others, and this God that sent the prophets that declared, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like ever-flowing streams. This consistent God for justice and liberation that culminated in the person of Jesus Christ, right? And that Jesus himself, right, came and expressed that he came to set the oppressed free, and was the new Moses, and stood in solidarity with those who are the least and last in society. And he told this really powerful story that culminated in the person of Jesus and his mission and what that meant. But then he also went from there and began to pivot and began to talk about some of the issues that were going on in our society. He began to talk about in fact, it was way before most people were, but talking about mass incarceration and racial oppression and the history of slavery and Jim Crow up to the present day, all these issues that had gone on, and the ways that white Christianity were complicit in so many of these forms of oppression throughout the centuries, right, in this land. And so he named white supremacy and white Christianity and all these different things, and explicitly talked about God's liberation and concern for those who are vulnerable in our society, especially as it related to race. And what was interesting for me as I was listening to him speak, again, like I grew up in a Black church. It wasn't necessarily strange to hear someone talk about race and faith together. And to think about how our lived experiences, how the gospel relates to the lived experiences that we were confronting every day. That wasn't necessarily strange, but what was fascinating was the radicalness, the boldness of how far he would go to really speak truthfully about all the realities of our society. And so again, I was intrigued, right? It was just a little bit different, not completely different, but a little bit different than maybe what I would have heard growing up. And so I began to lean in, trying to hear and think about what he was saying about who Jesus is and how he related to this broader society. And right again, as I began to lean in, I noticed that there was some other people again started to bail out, right? Now, it wasn't as much, right? In this case, like it was majority students of color, and there was only a small amount of white students, but some of the white students actually began to leave as he was talking about white supremacy and white Christianity and things like that. And it was just fascinating to me because, number one, the chapel was called Culture Shock, right? Like, I mean, what didn't you expect maybe to be challenged or to be wrestling with things, different perspectives? I don't know. So I was just surprised that they would be leaving if they were at a chapel called Culture Shock. But further than that, it also began to wrestle with, I began to wrestle with the fact that, like, in what ways, like, why couldn't they just sit and wrestle with this, right? Clearly, we have a long history of racism in our society. I mean, that's undeniable. So why couldn't they just sit and wrestle? Why did it seem that they were clinging to their whiteness more than they were clinging, again, to their identity enfolded in Christ? And so this was just another moment, these little aha moments where I'm like, something seems to be wrong in some people's Christian formation that doesn't seem capable of resisting American exceptionalism and white supremacy in the kind of ways that you might expect when you think about the things that Jesus lived and taught throughout his own life, right? And so I think that these are all examples of the ways that that we can begin to see there's this deeper problems going on in the life of the church that we've got to grapple with. One of the things that I think is important, like, I love church history. I love grappling with church history. And one of the things that I love to think about is like how we got to where we are today, right? Sometimes we can just think about like, oh, this is where we are and this is the way it's always been. But we don't necessarily think about like things happen over time. And so like you look at the early church, you have this, and really I want us to think about first the rise of Christendom in particular, right? You have these early Christians that, at least at the very earliest stages, are certainly have no political power, have no influence. They're on the margins. They're at least being made fun of for how many women and enslaved people are part of their communities, and so these are some of the realities, and some waves of persecution at different times that happened, certainly in the first 300 years of the church as well. And then, of course, people know about, or many people know about, Constantine, and he comes to rise in the 4th century, and he begins to give privileges and benefits and advantages to the church and to the bishops, right, in particular. And during that time, the church moves from the margins really to the center in very significant ways, in a whole variety of ways, beginning under the Constantinian era, and would continue. That path will continue on for centuries, right? About 100 years after him, Theodosius makes Christianity the official religion of the lands. Before you know it, the Christians who used to be persecuted are now persecuting others, right? There's this marriage of church and state. There's this coercive top-down Christianity. And what I call Christendom, like for everyday folks, is to say Christian supremacy over society, right? So that's what we're talking about. But that doesn't, it really culminates. It's actually a long story. Like sometimes people make it sound like it all happened during Constantine's era. It's really a centuries long story, and it culminates really in the medieval period. Like, in fact, you think about like Crusades, about 1,000 years in, right? You have this massive Christendom society that has emerged. And what begins to happen is that, especially in the midst of the Crusades and what's going on, is there's this way in which a sense of identity is forming, in which they're a Christian society and that's the heathen world out there, right? And we could talk in a little bit about the irony of them thinking in that way, but that is emerging, right? A Christian society, a Christian civilization is part of what's forming in the West at that time, even though for the majority of Christian history before that, the majority of Christians were actually in the East initially, right? And there was a switch and a swing happening, but for a very long time, the majority of Christians were in the East, not in the West. Anyway, so you have that, you have Constantine and medieval Christianity and the Crusades. And out of that moment, like a few centuries later, you have the birth of colonial conquest and white supremacy, right? Particularly like if you jump into the 15th century, you have Portugal begins to enslave people, right? A Christian, supposedly Christian society, they begin to enslave people in 1441. And then in 1455, the Pope actually gives a papal bull called Romanus Pontifex, right? And Romanus Pontifex basically just gives permission for people to enslave and to plunder and to exploit, reduce to perpetual slavery is the language, right? And just conquer people who are basically heathens, right? On Christian lands. And so it's interesting that the enslavement comes first in Portugal, and then Spain follows, and then there is the church actually doing the theologizing and the heavy lifting of giving official church teaching, giving permission for the West to go engage in this kind of conquest and enslavement and plundering of other people's lands. And then after that comes Christopher Columbus in 1492. A lot of people start with Christopher Columbus, but we miss that other history, that it's out of the womb of medieval Christendom, literally births colonial conquests and colonialism and white supremacy, is actually birthed out of the logics that what you can actually see in the history is that Christian supremacy is actually morphing into white supremacy as it's encountering the global world around the world. And so I think that there's these realities that we've got to tell a more truthful story about the way that white supremacy came into being. Because I think one of the things that we sometimes do is we make white supremacy seem like it's a social problem that just happened and the church has to kind of navigate it. And we don't see that literally Christian supremacy, the practice of Christian supremacy over society in the West, as it conflated itself with Christianity, merged and birthed white supremacy as a concept, as an ideology in the West. And so there's a few takeaways that we can learn from that long history. One is we see that in the West, there's been what Willie James Jennings calls the loss of Gentile identity. That is to say, there's a way in which many Western Europeans forget that they don't own Christianity, right? That Christianity is not indigenous to Western Europe, to Western civilization, and that forgetting that Gentile identity, that we've been engrafted into somebody else's story, right? Into Israel's story, into the Jews' story, into the life of Jesus, that by forgetting that, it shifts the kind of power dynamics of how people appropriate and engage Israel's story. And so there's this sense in which I say it in class that people sometimes have the sense in which white Western Europeans have a copyright on Christianity, a copyright on Jesus, and a copyright on biblical interpretation and theology, right? And so that everyone, if you want to become properly Christian, you come through us and we've got it all figured out, right? That kind of mentality. And I think that those are very deeply problematic. And so we've got to wrestle with that loss of Gentile identity. Also, the way in which Jesus is inherited throughout all of that then is Jesus is seen as the best of the West, right? He's the pinnacle of the West. The Western achievement is seen and is pushed on Jesus. So his Jewishness is kind of erased. He's technically Jewish, but he really represents Western civilization and its peak. And so Jesus himself, because of that, then is insufficient as a first century Palestinian Jew. He must also be converted into a white Western European male, right? And the church has, then again, in all of this, the church has not just been complicit in society, right? There's even good books that are out right now that talk about the church's complicity in racism. And that's true on one hand, but it's not enough to say complicit in racism if we also don't say that the church birthed racism into the world, right? That white supremacy is more than just a sociological problem, it's a theological heresy, right? That was birthed by the church. And so if it's a theological heresy and not just a sociological problem, then the church needs to treat it as such, not just a social problem, but also a theological problem as well. And so we've got to grapple with the significance of that. And if that's true, then Christian discipleship itself must become explicitly anti-racist and explicitly decolonizing in terms of the kind of faith and the kind of people that we produce in the world, so that we can resist and challenge the very defects, the mangled and diseased versions of faith that have vandalized the name of Jesus in the public square. One of the ways I think about it, given this history and the inertia and the power of it, is that it's not merely, it's almost like standing on an escalator, that if you're standing on the escalator and the escalator is moving, standing still, you're still moving, right? It's not good enough. You've actually, if you want to go in the opposite direction, you've got to actually intentionally, with efforts and intentionality, move in the other direction. And I think that sometimes we think that if we're just neutral on these things and we're not saying anything one way or the other, that we're not a part of it. But we don't realize there's this enormous inertia already embedded into our traditions and our ways of thinking, our ways of practice that are influencing us even when we're not doing anything at all. And so we've actually got to be intentional and in what does it mean to follow this crucified and risen Christ in the world today? How do we encounter the presence of Christ and participate in what God is doing, delivering, healing, restoring, liberating in our world? And so there's ways in which we've got to really grasp and tell a more truthful story that Christian supremacy was birthed white supremacy, right? It was in the womb of white supremacy. It was birthed and it matured out of Christian context, who did all kinds of theological work and biblical writing to justify. I mean, if you actually read some of the history of what Christians were saying, especially in the United States, to justify white supremacy over time, they kept changing Christian doctrines and teachings to justify the world as it was. And so we have to think then about what does it mean to transform the church, right? I'm first and foremost a church theologian before I'm anything else. Sometimes people think of me first as a public theologian. I am that, but I'm first a church theologian. I love the church. I'm involved in the church. I attend Harrisburg First Church of the Brethren, and there I preach, and I'm participants. I'm on committees and all stuff. I'm involved. I care about the life of the church deeply. And so we've got to think about how do we begin to transform the church. I remember I went to a conference. This was a few years ago, and it was a Mennonite conference I was invited to speak at. And they wanted to look at justice, and they wanted it was like two things kind of blended together for this conference, a biblical understanding of justice, and also they wanted to blend that in with like leadership principles, basically, right? And so they had me do the biblical justice part, and they had brought somebody else in. And so I did the opening day plenary on justice and talked about it from a biblical standpoint. The next day they had someone kind of doing leadership principles. And one of the things that they talked about was, I kind of adapted a little bit, but it's this idea of like adjusting the temperature in the room, right? Like, you know, if you can turn the temperature and make it like too hot for people where you're uncomfortable, you can make it too cold and people are stiff and uncomfortable. And sometimes you can find like just the right temperature. And I thought it was actually a helpful metaphor in the sense that that we can control the atmosphere. Like sometimes we get so comfortable with the status quo of how things work, and that we just kind of go along with it. And we don't think about the role that each of us can play, every single one of us, to kind of set the temperature in the room. That sometimes the right temperature is that comfortable temperature. Sometimes we need to turn it up a little bit, right? Sometimes that's what's needed. Sometimes we got to cool each other off a little bit, right? But what we say and what we speak into the room, when someone says something wrong, do we just everyone pretend like it didn't happen? Or does somebody say something that can interrupt the space with a prophetic intervention, and so that we can wrestle with what we need to wrestle with in that space together? Sometimes we can change the temperature in the room. And so during this conference, that was what we talked about on Saturday. And then on Sunday, they asked me to do the closing sermon. And it was in the church that's kind of on site there. And so for the end of the service, the whole church that actually gathers there was a part of the conference at the end as well. And so the pastors who hadn't been a part of the former conference were there, and they were praying and leading kind of like a call and response prayer. And like the prayer, it was interesting because the prayer was like, you know, praying for all the racism and the violence out there, right? All these bad things out there. And what was interesting was that our conference had been more focused on like our own communities, our own organizations, and like our own role within them. And so it was a little disconnected. And so I was thinking like, all right, this is not necessarily like the best setup for me getting up to preach soon, but you know, you got to do what you got to do. Well, at the end of that sermon, at the end of the prayer, I hear someone yell out, "Stop, stop, that's not right, that's not right." And I'm thinking like, what in the world is going on? So I look back, and I recognize this woman. I won't say her name since we're recording, but I look back and I see this woman that I know, and she is a professor in biblical studies, and she's yelling, "Stop, stop, this isn't right." And she teaches at that university there. And so I'm thinking like, why is she like disrupting and yelling in this like fairly, I would consider mostly white middle class, maybe some upper class, you know, kind of congregation, that I'm pretty sure that this is not the norm for their normal conduct. And so I look back again, and I'm thinking like trying to make sense of what's happening. I'm thinking like maybe this is like a church skit, right? Like maybe this was planned out or something. Why is she like interrupting the space? And so I look at her and I noticed a couple of things. Her voice was quivering a little bit and her hand was shaking some. And so I'm thinking like, that's strange, because I know this woman, she actually loves drama and acting and things like that. So I'm like, I'm pretty sure if this was a church skit, this wouldn't be like, you know, that nerve-wracking for her. So I was like, what is going on? And so she continues on, stop, this isn't right. And she's like, we're acting like the racism and all the violence and problems are just out there. And we haven't confessed, even in our own congregation, our own complicity to racism, our own white privilege, our own ways that we've been silent to what's gone on in our society and all that stuff. And it was really fascinating. Of course, very quickly, I realized this is not a church skit at all, right? She's literally prophetically intervening, or as I was saying before, adjusting the temperature in the room to kind of is disrupting space in a healthy way, good trouble, right? In terms of moving from just a service to actually being a community that's invited to actually seek what God is calling for us. And what was actually beautiful about this moment was that the pastors there, they could have gotten very defensive. They could have shut down. They could have ignored her, but they actually received what she said and actually re-prayed and prayed in a really more healthy way, and that tied into what we had been talking about. So it was just fascinating for me to actually see that play out. And I think it reminds us of the ways that each of us can play in terms of the transforming the church, that we all have a role to play in that place. I think that we have to grapple with, the life of the church and how we gather together, in what ways, what are we gathering around? In some ways we could ask the question, whose body has everyone else's body been revolving around? And is it really always Jesus Christ's? Or is there another body that stands there through which everybody else's body must comport and contort and revolve around, right? And I think that too often, if we look at Christian history in the United States, very often it's been not even just a white male body, but the idea, the myth of the white male body that everyone else has had to conform and contort their bodies and lives around too often in the life of the church. And so we've got to grapple with that, right? In what way is Jesus not actually standing at the center of who we are and all that we do? I often give the analogy that, imagine that we were gathered together in an actual space. I know it's hard to imagine during pandemic, but imagine that we would gather weekly. We'd come into a room and there's this big table, and every week that we gather, everyone would sit around the table except for me. I would stand on the center of the table, right? And this is what we do week after week. We gather, everyone sits around in the chairs around the table, and I stand on the table and I stand right in the center of it. And I imagine that after a while, maybe like, Reverend LaDonna one day, she's like, Drew, how about you, join the rest of us and sit around the table? Why, that might be a good idea. I might not like that. I might not like the attention being put on me in that way. And I might even act a little defensive. I might say, look, I'm trying to steward my position here. I'm trying to be benevolent and try to use my position for good. And so, why am I being picked on, right? I have no ill will towards anybody. I'm not hurting everybody. I've found that this system is working just fine. I've been fine with it all this time. I don't understand what the fuss is about. Why is everybody picking on me, right? In fact, I might go as far as to say, why are you trying to marginalize me? This is not right. Stop trying to marginalize me, right? And I think that in that moment, hopefully, and I know that certainly Reverend LaDonna would do this, she would tell a more truthful story, right? She would say, Drew, no one's trying to marginalize you. It's the opposite, right? You're being invited into equality around the table, just like everybody else. And so what you're describing as marginalization is not marginalization, it's just decentralization, right? There's a difference between marginalization and decentralization. And it doesn't mean that there's no disorientation that's being filled, because shifting is happening. But the fact is, what's the end goal? What are we working towards? And hopefully we're going to end up working towards a place where shalom, where the flourishing and thriving of all of us is there, where hierarchy is flattened, and where God reigns and is ultimate and preeminent over our lives, right? That's the end goal that we're working towards. And I think that we have to find ways in our communities to name, as people say, the elephant in the room, right? The way that hierarchy structures both, whether it be by racism, sexism, classism, these different ways that we structure our lives together in ways that are hierarchical, where those who've been accustomed and normed in being at the center, it's going to be disorienting. It's going to be uncomfortable at times. And it's okay. They're human beings. They can express discomfort, but that shouldn't come at the expense of actually transforming our lives together. And so we invite people to tell more truthful stories about what is actually happening as we transform our communities together. And the other thing I want to say about transforming the church is that we've got to begin to have more honest conversations around power dynamics and decision-making power in the life of the church. I think churches sometimes, unfortunately, are very naive as it relates to power, which is very interesting because power dynamics sometimes are running wild. And maybe it's precisely because because we're naive about them, that we allow them to run wild without naming what's happening all around us, right? And so, and when I say power dynamics, I'm not just talking about, like, a lot of times we just think about, like, who's the pastor and they need to fix this and that and it's all on them, right? That's not what I mean. When I'm talking about power, I mean, certainly they operate, there's formal official power in terms of structures of the church and the polity, but there's also informal power, and there's visible power and invisible power, right? Sometimes there's folks who have power because they have the right last name, or because they're big donors, right? Or whatever, what racial dynamics or gender dynamics or whatever is going on like the church. And we've got to be able to name and identify, like, how are the power dynamics playing out, and how are some people being excluded or discriminated against or overlooked in the life of the church, right? In fact, I do a whole section in the book on Acts 6 and the deacons, right? And the way that the first deacons are chosen, and how that can teach us about how to deal with power dynamics in the life of the church. And I think that we've got to deal with those things. We can't just pretend like they're not happening because they are already happening. So how do we do them in faithful ways? How do we share power together? And how do we be intentional about leadership, and who is at the table to have influence in terms of decision making and all of that as well. The other thing, before I'm about to wrap us up, but the other thing I want to say is that, you know, sometimes churches, when we're thinking about what's going on in the public square, sometimes churches avoid talking about what's going on. In fact, sometimes I've heard folks say that, oh, well, we can't talk about racial injustice or these kind of things like that because that's politics, and politics don't belong in the life of the church, right? And what's fascinating about it is, number one, it's not really true, because I think we've conflated politics and partisanship, right? But God, in some ways, like, politics just means the way that we organize ourselves, our society, right? Are we concerned as Christians with how we organize our society? Of course we are, because we're concerned about the vulnerable. We're concerned about the poor. We're concerned about the hurting. We're concerned about the sick, right? In our society. And so of course we're concerned about how we organize our society together. And God has a dream, a shalom for all of creation. It's all encompassing. It's not just a matter of Jesus in my heart. Jesus wants to be more than just in your heart. Jesus reigns, right? And Jesus is ultimate, and has a vision and a dream for all of creation. And so we're invited in the way of Jesus into the public square to participate in God's justice and God's love and God's peace. And so what we ought not to be partisan, right? We should not be, oh, well, we're team Democrats, and so that's how we think, or we're team Republican, so that's how we think. Too often we allow the political partisan platforms to shape the ethics of the life of the church, and then we lack the capacity to have a prophetic voice from the grassroots in terms of what's going on in our society today. But that doesn't mean that we're not political. In some ways, you could say Jesus saying that the kingdom of God has come is almost like saying God's politics, right? God's reign, God's way of organizing life has immersed from the bottom, not from the top down, not coercively, but from the bottom up. It is here. And it has a vision, that God has a vision for all of society, invites us to speak prophetically. And Jesus goes, he challenges constantly both the local customs and laws of his day, but he goes to the center of power, right? In Jerusalem, both religious power, but political and economic and cultural power, right? And he clashes and confronts the establishment there and calls them a den of robbers, and invokes Jeremiah, you den of robbers, right? For the way that they had been harming those worshipers who were being exploited and taken advantage of there. And so we, in the way of Jesus, are also called in to have a prophetic witness in our society. Like Jesus, who he teases the religious leaders, right? And says, you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, human, right? That's the windowsill plants, but you neglect the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness, right? That's Jesus echoing the prophetic tradition, where we're called to do justice, to let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like ever-flowing streams. What does God require of you but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God? And so that's the invitation. And so for us then, we've got an invitation to go and do the work. And there's this scene in Luke 19 where Jesus is approaching Jerusalem. He looks over Jerusalem and he weeps. And he actually says, if only they had known the things that make for peace, right? And this is not peace in like the English way of, American way of understanding peace as the absence of violence. This is shalom, right? In the Hebrew vision of shalom, this presence of justice and righteousness and peace and joy and harmony and interconnectedness and the thriving and flourishing of all creation, right? Where God reigns and is ultimate over it all. That's the kind of shalom that we're talking about. And Jesus, he's inviting us to think about what are the things that lead to shalom. What are they, right? That's some of, and I deeply believe it's literally embedded in the life of Jesus, in the teachings of Jesus, and his pursuit and invitation for us to seek first God's reign here on earth. That there are the things that we engage in. And so thinking about that, and I can't get into it in depth, but certainly in Who Will Be a Witness, I unpack it more, but there's ways that we can pursue justice at the grassroots level in our communities, that are faithful ways to do it as Christians, as the church, in our own communities in solidarity with those who are most oppressed. And so I'm thinking about social strategies, of course, like nonviolent resistance in the way of Jesus, protest movements, community organizing. There's a whole variety of ways that we can think through, and I help us think through it through the book in terms of the strengths and weaknesses of different strategies, and their effectiveness as well, because I think there's misconceptions around how these things actually work. But there's work to be done in our local communities because there's injustice, and the way things are not the way God intends them to be. So finally, I'll just wrap up with one final story. It's a story I love to tell, and it's a Dr. King story. He was in Birmingham, Alabama, and in 1963, because Birmingham was known as Bombingham, right? Because of all the unsolved bombings of Black houses and churches and leaders, and because it was a deeply segregated city there in the South, and they wanted to bring change. And if they could make change in Birmingham, that there would be impact broadly everywhere. But as they were going about their work, very few people were actually showing up the way that they had expected. They couldn't get folks to come out, and they were coming up towards Passover weekends and Good Friday, and they just got an injunction against marching, and they were running out of bail funds. And most of the leaders, they got together in a hotel room and they were talking about what to do and strategizing. And many of the leaders were like, look, we've got to go back to, our churches. It's Easter weekend. Like, that's the most important weekends, in the church calendar. We've got to be there for that. And others were saying, no, we've got to march. We can resist the injunction and go to jail. Others were saying, no, we got to send Dr. King out so he can raise funds and so we can get more bail money so that we can then revive the movement. And this whole time, a whole bunch of people are arguing and debating about what to do, but Dr. King is just sitting there quietly. He's not saying anything at all. He's just listening to everybody as they share their opinion. Then suddenly, as they're arguing, Dr. King just gets up and leaves. Like, you can imagine like the hotel rooms, we have like a living room space and then a bedroom on the side. They're in the living room space. He gets up, he goes into the bedroom and closes the door and just leaves them there by themselves. And so it's kind of strange what's going on. And if you can imagine, like, oftentimes when you see Dr. King, he usually has like that kind of like black suit, black tie, kind of clean, classic look. But when he opens the door open, Dr. King has changed his clothes. He's completely changed his clothes from what he was wearing before. Now, all of a sudden, he's wearing blue jeans and a blue work shirt. He's changed his clothes into blue jeans and a blue work shirt. And the moment everybody sees him, they know exactly what this means. They know that it means it's time to roll up our sleeves and get to work, right? And that they're going to go and that they're going to get arrested and go to Birmingham jail over Passover weekend and Easter weekend. And that's exactly what they did. In fact, there's a famous image of Dr. King with Ralph Abernathy and Fred Shuttlesworth beside him, and all three of them are wearing blue work shirt and blue jeans. And so when I think about that story, I think that not only is he modeling the example of what it means to not just getting caught up with the religiosity of the tradition of our faith, but to literally embody the story of Jesus in the public square, willing to even accept the consequences of going to jail because of the faithfulness, right? And I think that that's an invitation for us, right? That it's time for us to get to work, that it's time for us to be a witness, right? It's time for the church to move from a mangled witness to a faithful prophetic witness in our society in response to the injustice that's going on. It's time for us to put on our blue jeans, right? And so my invitation is, let's put on our blue jeans. Let's put on our blue jeans for justice. Let's put on our blue jeans for righteousness. Let's put on our blue jeans for peace. Let's put on our blue jeans because there's disproportionate suffering going on, that our neighbors are locked up in prisons disproportionately. Some of our neighbors are undocumented and are scared to move because of ICE agents on the move in their neighborhoods. We've got folks with inadequate housing or education. We've got police brutality going on all across our nation. There's just so much work to be done. And this is not the way that God intended it, right? God's dream is much better than this for us. And so let's put on our jeans and let's collaborate and let's struggle and let's participate in the good work that God is doing, overcoming evil with good. Thank you.
Wow, wow, wow. Well, just where you are, dear friends, let's put our hands together and just give thanks for this talk. You presented us with quite a lot. Drew, thank you so much. And guess what? It's time to put our blue jeans on. And what I heard is it's time to roll up our sleeves. So thank you. I want to invite us just for a moment as we transition into our question, answer, and dialogue time, that you just take a moment to breathe. If I had started off, I would have asked everyone to have a notebook with you, a journal. And before we get into the questions and going back and forth, just write down a couple thoughts that you have. Of what spoke to you, what is speaking to you right now. I know what I heard is time to roll up your sleeves and put on our jeans. But let's just take like 1 minute to be still and behold what we heard here. All right. All right, Drew, thank you. How are you doing there after that talk? Wow.
I'm doing all right.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much. We have some questions that have come in, and also some a few questions that we have prepared. So we'll ask those to you. The first question that comes up, and you covered this in your talk, but specifically as you think about the church and the churches today, and as you think about the Church of the Brethren in particular, what is your hope for churches and Church of the Brethren? What is your hope for us in these times?
Yeah, what is my hope? I mean, my hope, I guess, is simply that we would be captivated enough by Jesus that we would actually bear witness to who we are called to be in the world, right? Not just as little gatherings that have weekly services, but that we are a people, a called out people who've been sent and are present here to bear witness to God's reign, and that we do that boldly and courageously and fearlessly, and that God got us, right? That God is with us, that he will not leave us alone, and that when we actually, like, what we do actually does matter. When we're silenced, that makes a difference, right? But when we speak up and we stand up and we participate in God's healing and restoration and liberation, like that makes a difference as well. There's been times in which, you know, in the life of the church, when it has stood up for what God desires, like change actually can come out of that. And I think that we can bear witness. And I think right now it would be foolish for any of us to not take seriously how much we vandalize the name of Jesus. And that my generation and younger in particular, people are leaving the church in untold numbers. Not all churches, because some churches are actually scratching where they're itching and wrestling with how the gospel relates to the suffering and injustices that they see in society. But many right now, they're deeply disappointed. I'm hearing it all. I work with young people. They're deeply disappointed. And if this is what Jesus is about, then I don't want to have anything to do with it, right? That's what some people are. And so my hope is that I love Jesus too much to see people walking away because we've misrepresented Jesus. I'd rather people walk away because, you know, we bared a faithful witness to who he is, and they say, yeah, that's not for me, right? The rich young ruler, that's a little too much, right? That's one thing. But that we've vandalized the image of Jesus in the public square, and have turned people away because of that. I think that is really sad. And I think that we can be so much more faithful and can make a difference in people's actual lived experiences. People are suffering right now. People are hurting. And we should be attentive to that hurting. And Jesus says, as you know, it's precisely as we are attentive to these least of these, that we attend to Jesus's presence in our midst as well, right? And we ought to take that seriously also.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I notice in the context that we're living in, sometimes as things unfold, whether that be the Capitol insurrection, whether that be the murders of various people in the public space, rarely do we go first to Jesus, or is Jesus even mentioned? That's not an indictment on everyone, but I noticed that it's more debate back and forth, or silence, or people speaking out. But that's pretty, that's something to think about, to return to Jesus and discipleship.
Yeah, I'm definitely, I often say I'm deeply drawn by what I call the radical discipleship wing of the Anabaptists, which is deeply turned towards Jesus and the way of Jesus, right? And not losing sight of Jesus in that kind of way. And I think that and it's contagious. Jesus is contagious. That when we actually take Jesus seriously, I think people in Harrisburg, like I do all kinds of work in the public square. I know some people say, "Oh, Christians are being persecuted." Look, I'm welcomed in all kinds of different spaces, and I'm very vocal about who I am as a follower of Jesus. And I think that it's not Jesus that is being turned away. It's our unfaithfulness, our mangling of the witness of Jesus, right? That I think is what people have a problem with. And so I think that now more than ever, our commitment to Jesus should be evidence. And yeah, so I lean in. I mean, when I use that lean in, bail out, but I use that language because I want us to lean in more to Jesus, not to just use Jesus for a political agenda, but that Jesus is on my political agenda, right? That God's reign has come and is coming and will be culminated one day.
Thank you. Drew, you talked a bit about young people and their thoughts of how they see the church. One common question that comes up is, what do we say to our young people? How do you engage young people in being a witness? Or as others have asked, how do I talk to my youth about what happened in Washington, D.C., or what happened here? Can you talk about the role of engaging youth and the role of adults or leaders or church folk in that?
Yeah, this is very important. This is so important. And I mean, I think it's almost cliche now because it's just been said in the news and in TV and movies and stuff, but like Black families are already having these conversations, right? Intergenerational conversations. I know certainly in my family, We have conversations around the dinner table around what's happening in our world. My kids are young, but they're hearing this is just a part of it. So they're not shielded from, obviously, age appropriate. We're not going to say there's certain things that, they're not going to fully understand everything, but we can't pretend like we're doing them a benefit by not helping them understand the world that they're living in. And one of the things that actually has struck me as I've thought about the kind of conversations that need to be had, especially in the life of the church, is I have some white friends who I would say, I'll call them anti-racist white friends, right? But what's been fascinating for me is watching them with their family, that they've struggled to pass that on to their children. And I don't think there was intentionality around the kind of conversations that they were having with their own kids. Almost like, oh, well, they'll just, I don't know, they just assume that they'll get it somehow without the intentionality. And so there's this kind of intergenerational like gap, and so it's not being passed on from generation to generation. And I'd say even in congregations that there needs to be intentionality, thinking about like, what does anti-racist discipleship look like for all ages, and and can we have honest intergenerational conversations about where we come from? Because it's fascinating to me, all my students, I mean, as far as they're concerned, they think that everybody that, their parents and grandparents all supported Dr. King. And I tell them this at Messiah, white evangelical students, I tell them that's just not true. I don't know specifically about each one of your families, but I know statistically, all your families did not support Dr. King because the majority of white Christians didn't, right? That's just, and so there's not even these open conversations around like, oh, we failed. Like that would actually be more meaningful for a young white person coming up to hear their grandparents say, you know what? When Dr. King was around, we failed. We missed it, right? We called him a socialist or a communist and disregarded him, and we were not in tune. And now we can see that the church should have been. Like that actually be a more helpful conversation point, because then they can say, oh, you know what? We haven't always had this thing figured out. And we've made mistakes, and I can learn from the mistakes of those who come before me. So I think some of it is just truthfulness about where we've come from on an intergenerational level, and then having intentional programming, teaching, age appropriate, that's not shielding. It's not, I mean, I would say like, if I was a white parent and I love my kids, I don't want them to be racist, right? That's not what's best for them. That's not my highest ideal so I'm doing what I can because of how I know how much inertia of culture and white supremacy and all stuff in society, aside from doing it like for other people, like I wouldn't want that for my children. And so I would be doing everything that I could to have these conversations, because I know how perceptive, how it's almost like the invisible gas, right? Seeping into your house, right? You don't even know it's like you've got to stay vigilant, right? And I think that that's the kind of posture I think white parents and church leaders ought to have as they're thinking about engaging children, is they're already seeping in this stuff. It's in the air already. And so we've got to stay vigilant and intentional about having conversations about programming, about what they're being introduced to, what encounters, what experiences they're going to have. And they're not just going to learn from what you say, right? They say racism isn't just taught, it's caught. They're watching you, right? So what spaces do you go into? Whose bodies are your body alongside of, right? They're learning from you, from your example as well. And so I think all of those things are really important. So it's got to be a holistic way of engaging our young folks from very early on up, because very early on, the statistics show that they're learning race much earlier than we think they are.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Moving to another question. Given the church's theological heresy that you spoke about, the church's relationship to giving birth to racism, how can the church begin to repent of that immense historical and institutional sinfulness?
Yeah. I mean, I think the very first step is confessing and telling the truth, right? Like that's there's no repentance without truth telling. And so that's the starting points. And I think that it's unfortunate that we don't even know we've been shielded. I mean, it took me researching and exploring, diving deep to even figure out the history of how we got to where we are. It's not common knowledge, right? And so I think that the very first step is just that confessing. If we're going to repent, we've got to tell a truthful story about about where we come from. And we can think about it on multiple layers. Our own lives tell a truthful story about where we've been, where we're going. I think that even, I'll say woke Christians, right? Sometimes pretend like they always was woke, right? No, you weren't. Just yesterday, I heard you saying X, Y, Z. Now you want to shame everybody else who aren't on the journey all the way. No, let's be more honest. And that humility and grace can actually be helpful in helping other people journey along when you help them see where you've come from and where you've been and how you got to where you were, rather than pretending, right, and posturing, virtue signaling as if you were always understanding these things. And so I think some of that is really important. But then, of course, repentance is not just feeling sorry. Like, there's a temptation, I think, that to almost feel like feeling guilty can be the work, right? And so I just engage in material that make me feel bad, so I just feel guilty and I'm crying a lot. And then that's the work, right? No, I have white privilege and I got to feel bad about it, right? No, that's not the work. It might be an inevitable stage that you're going to go through, is that you're going to feel you're a human being. If you have empathy and connection with the impact it had on other people, and sure, you're going to feel something, but the work itself, it goes beyond that. It's the new practices. It's the new way of life. It's the new learnings, it's new experiences. It's taking risks, and even failing sometimes, right? Sometimes white people get scared about not doing the right thing or saying the right thing. That's okay. That's a part of the process, right? Is messing up, because we're humans. I think it's actually helpful for white Christians to realize, in some of the reformation that needs to happen, is becoming the student rather than the teacher, right? Usually white Christians think of themselves as the student, as having everything to teach and nothing to learn. No, in this posture, the roles are often usually swapped, right? Where usually you're going to have to learn and listen well and receive and slowly be transformed in the midst of that, and have new eyes to see what's going on in ways that you hadn't before. And so I think that new posture, where the first are last and last are first, needs to be put into practice. How do we actually practice this in actual ways? And then, of course, repentance. If we're really repentant, right, then you make amends for what you did, right? Like if my kids, it hasn't synced in all the way yet, but I keep trying. One of them will, hit someone or do something to one of and I'm like, you can't just walk away after that. So they'll say sorry, and then they just walk away. I'm like, no. We don't do that in our house. Sorry doesn't mean anything in this house. Like, you wronged them, you need to go make it right with your brother, right? And so how are we going to make these relationships right and restore people back to where they were? It's interesting. I often say, in fact, it's in the book, the Zacchaeus story. We've done quite a number on the Zacchaeus story. We have the fancy little cute song about Zacchaeus was a wee little man and all this stuff, climbed up in the sycamore tree. But at the end of the song, we cut off the whole culmination of the point of the story, right? The whole story goes towards, he's been exploiting people as a chief tax collector. And now, after having his Jesus moment, he's going to engage in redistribution of wealth. He says half of his wealth he's going to give to the poor, and reparations, 4 times what he had taken and exploited, he's going to give back, right? He actually, and the fact that it's 4 times is very fascinating, because it's not just about a simple calculation. He actually cares about their flourishing, right? He actually cares about their well-being and their flourishing enough that he's going to do it radically. And that story in Luke is actually foiled with the story before, with the rich young ruler who walks away sad, right? Those 2 stories are positioned in that way. So you have these 2 different responses to Jesus in terms of one who will not engage in Jesus's Jubilee revolution, and Zacchaeus who does, right? And it's not just only about wealth in terms of money, but it's a holistic sense in all kinds of ways. How do we make this right? And if we actually care about the wrongs that's been done over time, not just during slavery, not just during Jim Crow, though we have many people who are still alive who lived under Jim Crow, but also the ongoing harm that's being done that has never ceased, right, in our society today. How do we stop that from happening, and then make things right with our neighbor? And so these are biblical ideas that I think often are not on the table for conversation for many Christians as they're thinking about repentance and the fullest Christian meaning of repentance.
Thank you for that. That's a really helpful blueprint for how to move forward, I would think in repenting, when you said, how do we make it right? How do we make it right? Well, I want to go to this question. It starts with a statement. It says, I struggle with knowing how to engage in conversations about racism, white supremacy, and privilege, but also with someone who exhibits a racist attitude. So I struggle with that as well. I guess I worry, says the question, it will end in a shouting match. How do I go about doing this in a way that will allow for conversation, a chance to listen, and provide space for possible transformation?
Yeah. Yeah, this is the work, right? This is the work. And I think if you're in a relationship with someone, then the goal isn't that you're going to win them over by some great debate, right, in the moment. Like that's just not what's going to happen, to win them over. But what you can do, number one, is to always faithfully bear witness in their presence. So if somebody says, I often tell my students, look, you don't always have to have the fancy answer, but you need to, at the very minimum, say, that's not right. I don't even have all the words, but I can tell you that that's not right what you're saying. And I'm disappointed that you think that, right? Or something like that. And sometimes that's all that you can say in any given moment, right? You don't always have to have, I know some people who just can't always think of what to say until afterwards. They're like, oh, I wish I had said X, Y, Z. Yeah, that's fine. Sometimes you won't always have all the things to say. But if it's an ongoing relationship with them, then you can be intentional and have conversations and tell your own story, right? What are stories I think are sometimes more powerful than just trying to like convince somebody of this or that or that. And the other thing is actually experiences, right? So for example, I knew there was the second time that I went on a civil rights bus tour. I had brought about like 10 people with me, right? I can't, after going once, I was like, I can't just hold this to my own. I got to bring other folks with me. So about 10 of us went on this trip. And one of the people was an older white man who at that time I didn't know as well, but I was starting to know. And he was more out of our group. He was kind of like, had more racist inclinations. We'll say it like that, right? And so while we're on this trip, he was actually very quiet during that time. He wasn't saying a lot. Most of us were kind of engaging. He just kind of, I don't know if he was just reflective, whatever. But partway through the trip, 9-day trip, he says, you know, maybe we were wrong all this time. You know, like he made these like little comments like that. Like it was, the experience was starting to seep in. And it was just, it's like, I think sometimes lived experiences and being exposed to things that someone might not have been and seeing things from different perspectives can be really powerful. And so in that case, that's what was happening. It was unfolding. Now, the unfortunate thing was, and I look back now and I'm like, I didn't do my part, which was I should have kept up with him, because I think over time that just faded away. And so there was lessons I learned from that as well about the power of experience and seeing things from different perspectives, but also that people need a journey, right? To stay on the journey. And sometimes people don't know where to go with that. And so I probably could have made a much more significant, I could have been there to point him maybe in a better direction that wouldn't have allowed him to just slip back to his kind of normal routine. But so yeah, so that lived experiences, unsettling experiences, places where people are uncomfortable, where things aren't just the norm and the status quo of what they're used to all the time, can often create the kind of dissonance, right? The cognitive dissonance where people have got to ask different questions and see things from different perspectives because their old answers don't make sense anymore, right? I think that that's really helpful. But also people, like I do think like our narrative, they say facts in general are not what convince people, right? Sometimes facts in addition to other stuff can be helpful, but it's storytelling in personal relationships and connections and lived experiences and things like that that often are way more formative than, you know, just the facts. And again, I don't think that we would just debate our way to freedom, right? I just don't think that that's the way it's going to work. Sometimes I wish that was the case, right? And there are some people who are open-minded and they'll kind of go with you, but sometimes we're all in different ways, find ourselves closed off to certain things at different points, right? All of us find ourselves in that place. And so if we can tap into our memories of ways that we've been in that way, it can help us remind ourselves of why somebody else is being so defensive and shutting down and lashing out. And maybe that can help as well. But if there are relationships, I often encourage white Christians in particular, like, don't be cutting off all the relationships with your racist relatives or something, right? Actually, we need you to be in relationship, and to not only because it's, it's your family, but also a lot of those folks are not going to have the conversation with me in the same kind of way. So be in those relationships, stay faithful, love them. It's hard work. It's frustrating, I'm sure, at times. They talk, I'm sure I hear white Christians talk about Thanksgiving dinner and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. But show up, but speak up also. Don't be silent. That's not going to be doing the work either. You've got to at least say, bear witness, that ain't right. You know better than that. Something, right? It doesn't have to be fancy, but you just got to speak up at the very minimum. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So I know you have some closing comments that we're going to share. So this is going to be the last question. And along with those lines, I would want to invite everyone to join us on February 18th for our Q&A. It'll be an hour and a half of dialogue and Q&A. So this last question, there's actually two, but I'm going to ask this one because it's very common. What should we say, or what does one say to those who think or say, well, I'm not racist, so I don't need to worry about this?
Yeah. I mean, I think many people have been saying it in this way, that there is no such thing as not racist, right? It's going back to the escalator example. To not be anything is to also be something, because the escalator is moving. We're a part of a society with literally 400 years of white supremacy and anti-Black racism. 400 years, right? 250 years of legalized anti-Black slavery, another 100 years of informal slavery, when we're talking about convict leasing systems, chain gangs, sharecropping, peonage, right? On top of the Jim Crow system that went through most of the 20th century. And then now mass incarceration and, still ongoing disparate funding in terms of public education. And we could go on and on and on about all the different ways. So the question is, with those realities in place, what are we doing? If we're doing nothing, if we're always saying is we're not racists, that means we're complicit and silent to all these systems of racism that are part of our society today. What do it mean to, you live under, Nazi Germany? Well, I'm not participating in it. What does it mean? Are you resisting it, right? That to be faithful to the way of Jesus, you have to be resisting the evil and overcoming evil with good. And I think that we've got to challenge ourselves into anti-racist, intentionally and actively anti-racist ways of being, anti-racist discipleship in the way of Jesus. And I think that if we're not doing that, then we are complicit and we are participating in some way. Certainly we're advantaged and benefiting from a system that the whole society was built on genocide of indigenous people and a forcible removal from their sacred lands, and the stolen labor of Black people, and exploitation and expendability of Black life, certainly up to the present day. And so if we don't say anything, if we don't speak up, if we don't resist, then we are complicit. And while we are all sinful, it doesn't mean that we should be accepting of that sinfulness. We should be working to overcome that, because we have the power of the Spirit in us to regenerate us to be more than what we are and what we've been in the past.
Thank you. Thank you, Drew. And thank you, everyone, for being here. This has been amazing. And I want to say we're just getting started. So I really am serious where you are. Put your hands together and let's just give God thanks for this time, for Drew Hart, for really laying a groundwork for us and giving us a call to action to roll up our sleeves and put on our jeans and let's go. Listen, Drew, I'm going to say a couple announcements and then I'm going to ask you about how we can be in contact with you, and I will invite you to give the last word or anything you would like to share. But just by way of announcements, friends, I have been seeing your questions. And so want to say this, this is being recorded. This is a webinar and it will be on the website under webcasts when it is ready. So you can look out for that. And then I will ask you to share that widely with so many friends that could benefit from this. And then we really, when we were meeting, Drew Hart and I, just to talk about how this would unfold, we really wanted a whole session with question and answer and dialogue. And my intention was, so how do we get into this that he's talking about? So not just that he will come and tell us, but that you and that I and that we will reflect on our own context and think about where we go from there. So that will be next Thursday, February 18th. It will be at 3:30 Central. So just double check your times, but 3:30 Central. And most probably that will not be recorded and disseminated because we're going to be sharing together there. And so we welcome you to come. We'll be having these once a month. We'll be gathering like this for healing racism, congregations, and communities. So really want to encourage you to look out for that and invite your people, family, friends, church, whoever, community, friends to join. Uh, Two ways that you can stay connected is to be sure that you receive updates from Intercultural Ministries through the Church of the Brethren website. And also if you are on Facebook on Church of the Brethren Intercultural Ministries. One more announcement, if you are a clergy person, a credentialed clergy person, you can receive CEUs and you will be in contact with Brethren Academy regarding that. So they're ready to hear from you and we will share the attendance list. If you have any questions about that, we'll also put that in writing as we write you and thank you for coming to this. I believe that is all of the announcements, but wow, Drew Hart, this has been absolutely amazing. I'm so glad you're on board with us and journeying with us. And also let us know how we can be on board and journey with you, to pray for you, to support you. And I know one of the things you were sharing was your podcast. So I want everybody to know about that while we're on here so you can connect with these ideas. And then anything else you want to share with us, how we can be in contact with you.
Yeah, so you can find, so me and Jared McKenna, who's in Australia, we co-host a podcast together called Inverse Podcast. And so it's a lot of fun. It's a global conversation. We dialogue with guests from all over the world. And so you can listen to that. You can search it on iTunes and all the different places where you can find podcasts. We'll be there. And if you want to support us in that work that we're doing, there's an Inverse Patreon as well. And so you can support us there. But you can find me, I'm what they call an old millennial. So I'm on Twitter and Instagram, both at DRUHART, Drew Hart, and also a Facebook profile page as well. And doing quite a bit of online stuff. And so you can catch me other spaces. But looking forward to the partnership and ongoing work with Intercultural Ministries. And again, thank you, Reverend LaDonna, for the invitation to participate.
Well, you are welcome. Thank you. And for everyone who's in the chat, you can grab that link, those links now. I know someone asked, will we be giving out the chat? Most probably not, especially if it has people's names on it, but just take a moment while we're here and go ahead and get those links. And we'll also, Drew, we'll put your podcast on the Facebook page at Intercultural Ministries. So keep us posted on what you're doing. Well, God bless everyone. These programs, this webinar, your book studies, everything we're doing is here. And everything you're doing in the church and on the local level is here so that we can roll up our sleeves. We can put our jeans on, whatever you do to do the work. And we can say that the whole earth is crying out for us to do something differently. So I pray that you've been inspired I pray that you can connect with someone. And that's what February 18th will be all about. We can connect and see where you are across the country and how we can support one another. But thank you for being with us. God bless everyone. And we'll see you soon. Thank you.